Cents Per Mile, featuring Charles Gracie, Paul Gibson, and Josh Haynes. Everyone knows the trucking industry has issues, but most people are afraid to talk about it.
Someone's got to do it.
With loads of recruiting and marketing experience and backed by the largest driver audience in the world, we deliver carriers the driver perspective, find solutions, and help make sense make sense.
Thank you for tuning in to Cents Per Mile. I'm your host, Charles Gracie.
And I'm your co-host, Paul Gibson.
Hey, I'm Josh Haynes. What are we talking about today, guys?
We're talking about pain points, and not the ones in your neck, but the ones in your recruiting department.
Yep, the top 9 recruiter pain points that we feel are, probably the top 9 things that, affect your day-to-day as a recruiter, things to overcome, ways to possibly overcome them. We might not have all the answers, but I do have concepts of a plan. It's a ridiculous thing when you hear it on a t-shirt. That being said, we do have our normal stuff to talk about. We are on Spotify. We're on iHeartRadio. We're on Wreaths Across America. We're pretty much anywhere that you listen or watch podcasts. So if you could like, subscribe, rate, so that way it gets us further out and gets us more exposure to people. So the audience grows, so we can get to do more cool stuff.
You can also find us on centspermilepodcast.com, where you could submit a topic to be a guest or even become a sponsor.
Sponsor? Who's our sponsor today, Charles?
Driver's Legal Plan. The basic concept of this plan is simple. It's to make the highest quality CDL legal representation available to the driving force while making it affordable. Check them out at driverslegalplan.com.
All right, cool. Well, and the other thing that we've got coming up is FreightWave's Future of Freight Festival. We'll be there. We'll be partying very much as ourselves. We've got nothing else to do there besides just hang out with you. So if you want to come and hang out with us and party at the largest freight festival in the entire industry, probably the biggest party for the back end of trucking, come hang out with us. And there's also a QR code that you can scan that'll pop up on screen that will allow you to get a pretty steep discount because you know some guys.
Yeah, and I want to add to that. It is the Freight Festival, but when you present this to your boss, it's full of great content, but it's also a kick-ass party.
Yeah, there's lots of good stuff there. And the cool part is it's a mix of people from, different parts of the industry. So you can kind of see a lot of how certain things affect what you do that you might not have thought of before. Speaking of things you might not have thought of before, it's time for the news. All right, so it's time for 10-2 News, where we go through CDLLife. We look at some of the coolest, most ridiculous, most relevant articles from the past few weeks, and we talk about them. All right, so our first one is a driver sentenced to 5 years for smashing a car while using Netflix. Obviously, don't want to make light of this situation, even though I normally make jokes, because people did, it was a fatality accident. My whole thing that I wanted to talk about is when this driver got charged, he was listening to Netflix. He wasn't watching it. He was using the audio from what was on Netflix in place of an audiobook or something like that. So he wasn't actively holding his phone. He was just listening. But they said that constituted distracted driving. So my question is, how is that different from an audiobook or a podcast like ours or the radio?
I guess they're not as captivating. No slide on us as for entertainment's sake, but I mean, I drove and I used to listen to books. I used to, when I was driving, I used to crank the music. That was my thing. I drove nights. I cranked the music, jam out. But I knew drivers that were very strategic about the placement of their tablets or something, and they would stream and then they could see the reflection in the window. And it just, I don't know.
Well, and I get that, but I'm saying so let's give the benefit of a doubt. In that situation, though, is listening to the audio from a movie or a TV show, is that different than listening to different types of audio?
Audio's audio, man. If you're physically not distracted while listening to music and they've deemed that's okay, then listening to an audio book is okay. But where do we draw the line? Oh, because you were streaming Netflix, that constitutes a distraction. Now, if I don't think I could do it, I could never listen to the audio only without the visual component of streaming. I couldn't do it. Can you imagine watching Lord of the Rings with just the vocals? Like, yeah.
Well, half of it's just music and people walking, so you're not really missing out on much. Although that new Rings of Power show is pretty good. I don't know, but I just thought that was an interesting question. Charles specifically requested this story. UT football semi-truck smashes into barrier wall. Why don't you talk about that one, Charles?
I posted this on my social media when it happened, and I kind of put a pun to it. Was it offsides or a false start? But I mean, this kind of stinks. I mean, that is a good looking truck, and it was sitting on a side of the road, busted up. I'm not even sure it's repairable. It's a good excuse if you're a truck wholesaler to hit up University of Tennessee and offer a nice new Peterbilt. No shame intended on that one, because that's a winning team.
Or Kenworth.
It could be worse.
Yeah, it definitely could be worse.
I mean, it's open season right now. If I'm a truck wholesaler, I'm trying to replace that Peterbilt. It's a winning team, and I mean, it could be worse. You could have been the Notre Dame truck headed back after getting beat by Illinois.
Yeah. Well, it's a good thing everybody was okay, but definitely a flag on that play. And we try not to talk about truck accidents and mistakes that drivers make too much. But this one, so a truck driver flipped his truck. He was carrying walls, like pre-made walls for like houses and stuff. And he fell asleep at the wheel and his truck flipped completely over. And then he was able to escape out of the window. And I just can't help reading that. You ever have that sensation where you wake up and you're somewhere different than you normally are and you have no idea where you are?
Yeah, it's every day. It's coming to work.
Fair enough. Could you imagine having that feeling? All of a sudden you wake up and your truck is upside down. You're like, oh, where am I? Oh, should probably get out of here.
Hope I invested in the legal plan.
All right. And so our last story is a little near and dear to me and super sad.
To a lot of us.
Yeah. So Smart Trucking, if you're not familiar with them on YouTube, is probably one of the best resources in the industry to learn about what it takes to drive a truck, to learn about the driver experience, to learn about the driver perspective, which is something we're all about here. I mean, I've learned more from Smart Trucking. The only thing I've learned more from is experience, being in a truck, talking to drivers, seeing the back end of companies. But outside of that, the way the intricate ways things work, that's probably my biggest influence in perspective. And so with that, it's sad to say that Dave from Smart Trucking at the age of 68 did pass.
Yeah, I mean, he was the show itself and the experience he brought to it was a resource to a lot of companies and drivers out there. So, it is a heartfelt loss for the industry when you see someone that influential and that's offered resources. Everyone can offer a bunch of junk, but I mean, an actual resource to the industry. There's not as much of that as there is all the other fluff everyone throws out there. So he will be missed, and thoughts and prayers with his family.
People talk a lot about driver puppy mills and things like that, and a lack of training. And one of the cool things he did was take that further training that those drivers need and kind of put it on his shoulders and made a channel out of it. So yeah, he was huge. With that though, as heavy as that is, it's time to go behind the desk with Tenstreet.
My name is Ashley, and I'm one of the account managers here at Tenstreet. Thank you guys so much for having me back again. As I was thinking about recruiting pain points in 2024, it made me reflect on my time as a recruiter. I started recruiting back in 2012, and I think since then, recruiting pain points have only become increasingly worse over time. Recruiters just get more and more added to their plate. Based on a company structure, a recruiter could be wearing 50 million hats at one time. So I think we have to start by addressing how can I give my recruiters back time in their day while improving the driver experience. Here at Tenstreet, I think we're well known for our Intella app and how it removes friction from the application process as well as decrease abandonment rates when the driver is filling out the application. But I'm here to tell you guys, We have so many other tools that will help give your recruiters back time in their day. This includes, but not limited to, Express Lane, drip campaign, structured messages, pre-app messaging based on the driver's job preferences, and bulk communication, all of which is designed to help with your workflow and create a better candidate experience. It helps build human connections and relationships. It also keeps the driver in the know and gets them invested in your processes. Tenstreet can also help identify bottlenecks in your processes with actionable data and analytics. Now, quite often, recruiters can perform the same task over and over again. We can assist with that by creating processes, integration, and automation. We are here to help with your pain points and to help solve problems. So please reach out to us for more details over any questions that you may have. Again, we're here to help, and thank you guys so much for having me today.
Attention truckers, it only takes one ticket to lose your job because of unnecessary traffic convictions. But you can protect your career with Driver's Legal Plan, an actual national law firm dedicated to protecting the rights of truck drivers. We make the highest quality legal representation available to truck drivers, and we make it affordable. You can rest easy knowing you have a trucker's attorney always on your side. Call Driver's Legal Plan today to start protecting your driving record and your career.
It's time for Make Sense. And we're talking about the top 9 recruiter pain points. The first one that comes to mind is managing multiple vendors. And as somebody that's been in recruiting and been on the carrier side, I could tell you it is a pain point, because when you have multiple vendors, getting them to collaborate and coordinate your efforts without stepping on each other's toe or wasting your dollars, it's hard. And so those strategic vendor partners that can do that for you are going to be critical in addressing this. You know, Paul, you've sat in that role. I mean, that's tough.
Yeah, no. So, I mean, from managing multiple vendors to, obviously working for one, it's one of those things where it's kind of, so you see it, and that is, you hit it spot on, where it's like, oh, I'm going to give these people this money, I'm going to give these people this money, and a lot of their products can overlap. Obviously, they're all different, but their products can overlap, and you end up just tossing more money out and further saturating parts of the market. Which is one thing that is cool that we do here, is we will take a look at everything you're doing and then try to figure out where we can fit in to not overlap at CDLLife. But yeah, it's one of those things, regardless of who you're using, that's super important to pay attention to, because if you don't, then yeah, you're just burning budget, man.
Your money's competing against your own money.
Mm-hmm.
That's rough. And you are correct, though, about the internal structure. The one thing I'm grateful for about our teams and their collaboration is they do look at the holistic picture. They want to make sure that people are getting the bang for their buck, but not all are created equal. Some people just don't have that foresight, and it generally comes from people with the experience that have juggled multiple budgets on the other side and watched what happens when they compete against each other. Attribution is a tough thing as well.
Yeah, so if you do that and you've got money going up against money, you are kind of like going up against yourself. But if you're going up against yourself, does that make it easier to bet on yourself?
Well, I imagine either side wins, but imagine the funds that went to
All right, so the other one is low lead volume. Man, I know from my experience, the worst thing in the world, you run into it more like the holiday season coming up, especially between Thanksgiving and Christmas, which we have to start talking about again, unfortunately, especially in this market. But low lead volume, like when you come in on a Monday and like you have half the leads you thought you were going to have, that is terrifying.
Well, there's reasons behind it, though. I mean, and again, getting to know your vendors and getting to know where your strengths are as a company and finding people that can complement those, that can address this. Because today's lead is no different than a full app. The intent behind it is no different. It takes a driver a couple minutes to submit a lead for them. It takes them a couple minutes to do a full app with a lot of the systems out there. So it doesn't mean a higher intent. And then if you're an organization that doesn't have recruiter support on the weekend, a lot of the vendors, if you don't talk to them, automatically remove lead flow from the weekend because there's no one to address them. And we know how those time constraints of responses are so important.
Yep. I mean, it is pretty important to get to them when you get them. But the other thing with the low volume side of it is that does kind of force you to get more in depth with the leads that you do have and touch them a lot more, in hopes that you can get them on the phone. And when you do, like, you have to pretty much be on your game to make sure that you can convert those.
You got to be the expert of your offer. You are the first human element in this. And for you recruiters out there that haven't heard this before, it is very important to understand that, like, these leads are real people. They've shown interest in your job. Whether you got 10 leads when you walk in or 100, you got to treat them all the same and give them the same respect. So, I mean, this is one of those where, from the recruiting side of things, I feel very strongly about. I wish we can go back in time and get rid of the whole hanging our hat on leads and cost per lead, because I think the more important metric is the meaningful connections.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think that kind of also comes into our next one, which is wasted recruiter time. It's one of those things where there's a lot of things that happen in your job as a recruiter that waste your time. There's a reason why so many companies have definitely jumped on the bandwagon of hiring a processor, because that's one of the biggest time sucks that stops you from calling your leads and calling the people who are answering the phone even. Because you're so busy processing that, because there's so many regulations on what you need to have, for audits and safety departments and rah, rah, rah. The monotonous, like, clerical parts of the job. um but yeah, that's the thing, is there's so many different moving parts that people think all you do is just sit there and dial for drivers all day, and that's not the case.
But it even goes beyond that. I mean, you look at the parts of a recruiter's day that's wasted outside of even remove processing. Some of the things with technology advancements nowadays, and if you have the right partner, they can automate some of those mundane tasks, as far as touch points, re-engaging drivers, keeping them engaged through the platform. It's one of the biggest things that I've enjoyed since we merged with the parent company that works with CDLLife. Um, Having that recruiter experience with the vendor lead gen side of things, it offers different solutions because you're approaching the problem from two different angles. So it allows us to sit there and focus on the things and eliminating those mundane tasks. Keeping a driver engaged while they're going through the process, that's hard. You got to generally handhold it. So finding vendors that can focus on that is going to be critical to your success, which leads into the next most important pain point, in my opinion: cost per hire. That's one of those things where, depending on who you talk to, it's calculated differently, and there is no cookie cutter mold. I mean, you got the holistic cost per hire that encompasses all costs, from your overhead as far as a building to your marketing dollars, and then you got people that simplify it, and finding a partner and people that can work around how you represent that is going to be important, but also knowing how to calculate it. You'd be surprised how many people can't calculate it.
It's true. And it is easy to calculate on the basis of, like, oh, you take your marketing dollars that you spent versus the number of hires you got and divide it. But they're also, yeah, like you said, depending on who you ask. So, I mean, from an executive perspective, it's not just the marketing dollars; it's how long the trucks have been empty.
Turning over the tucks.
Yeah, turning over the trucks, the orientation, all of it. There's so many things involved, so it's like you might feel like you're doing a good job, but then when it comes to talk to your CFO or even the president or the CEO of the company, they're like, yeah, cost per hire is ridiculous. And with the cost of everything going up, the variation between calculating cost per hire based on marketing and calculating actual cost per hire are like starting to get like even further separate. It's almost like night and day, to where you almost have to focus on getting your marketing cost per hire down, so that way they're not just looking at the big number and saying, why is it so expensive to hire these drivers?
Well, and there's other big numbers they're looking at, like the big number that everyone's looking for every Monday and Wednesdays in orientation. Keeping the orientation classes full is a pain point. How do you do it? How do you maintain it? And how do you scale it? Because as companies scale, they need to make that scale as far as bringing in new talent. Keeping orientation classes full with today's no-show rates, drop rates, no response rates, it's a tough job.
What I thought was interesting was, a few years ago, a lot of companies started upping what they offer for orientation. Like a lot of companies will do like, oh, you'll get so much a day, you get so much in food, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of companies started offering like those not just sign-on bonuses, but like start bonuses. Like you'll get $1,000 as soon as you seat the truck. That became kind of trendy, but now it's become so normal that it's kind of reverted back to where it was. So it's kind of hard to figure out what a lot of things that you can offer other than, keeping the driver engaged and having something good to offer. But I mean, you do it all the time. It's literally your job. You run a company that does that. What would you say other than keeping the driver engaged and offering some sort of like startup pay? What's the best way to get those people to show up?
Well, honestly, I think it comes through constant communication. And I don't necessarily always advocate for it has to be the recruiter. The recruiter needs to maintain that relationship, but also your partners. One of the cool things that we've developed is, a trickling of information, selling points, things that the companies can offer that's a benefit to the drivers, connecting the dots from their problems to the solutions we offer or our carrier clients offer, and keeping that flow of information coming. Because if they're looking at that, what they're not looking at is the other offers out there. So I think people need to leverage that more and have talks with your partners. It's one of the cool things we've rolled out. Just like one of the cool things we rolled out is retention, which is our next pain point.
Yeah, and I mean retention is huge because I mean the orientation classes, if all your trucks were full and you never turned over drivers, you wouldn't have to worry about that. But that's just not the case with trucking. But I think so a good example is this podcast. Like talking to Charles for hours every week is oof, but it's while that's part of the process and being self-aware of that, it's when I go out and I see people and they're like, hey man, how's it going, that show was so good, makes it worth it. So like as a company, one thing I would say is definitely be self-aware of what sucks, what's bad about your company, what's terrible about the job, and then just use that to point out the positives and what you're doing and finding out ways to help, because you can only do so much, but you need to do what you can.
Well, and it's important. One of the things that we talk about for retention, like you said, is being self-aware. But being self-aware is not enough. You have to be willing to act on it. And that's where we see people fall short. They do all these surveys and all this stuff to find out where their shortcomings are, but they don't do anything to act on it. Follow through with it, isolate, those problems, and be prepared to have discussions on them. And some of them you can't fix, but at least talk about them and set up the expectation that they exist, because you're not going to be able to skip past it.
And I know I made that joke about Charles earlier. That's not true. I do love Charles. But I mean, one thing about the show is that it is set up fast at the beginning. If you ever notice, the beginning of our show is just shotgun style. And that's also important because you need to keep your drivers constantly engaged. They need to know what's going on. You don't necessarily need to like sit down and have a meeting about everything, because a lot of things can be an email or a Qualcomm message in this case, but it's important to constantly have their attention, because if you can have your driver's attention, they're not giving their attention somewhere else. It's important to focus on them as people and to make them think about you.
Yeah. And then there's the next pain point, orientation no-shows. I mean, this is a big one this year, especially this year. The driver mentality hasn't shifted away from that they're a necessary resource and they're unreplaceable. And so they think, hey, if I don't show up to orientation, I can reapply next week and you'll take me. And that's just not the case right now. Orientation no-shows is a big cost, a big expense to these carriers, and they started to crack down on it. I know a couple carriers where if you even delay orientation once you're approved, you're on a 6-month hold. If you no-show orientation, you're on a year hold, period. Doesn't matter how good you are. So if I'm a driver out there, I need to be self-aware of this. But if I'm a recruiter, I'm communicating this. Education is the number one way to combat this. Educate them what they're up against. Educate the drivers to set those expectations that, hey, if you're going through this process, that means you want this job. If you don't want this job, just communicate so I can help you help yourself.
Yeah, and I mean, and we kind of talked about that too with with some of the keeping the orientation classes full. But I mean, the other part of the no-show thing too is it's tough when a lot of people are, it's proven statistically that most of these drivers are applying to multiple places. They're not just applying to you. So it's one of those things, back to them being people and holding their attention. You have to do that, because the more you can hold their attention, the more they're not going to give it to somebody else. It's kind of like already starting that relationship. You start dating somebody and then you barely pay attention to them, they're going to start talking to other people. And if they're already talking to other people, they're going to talk to them more because they have their attention. And so it's just really, really important to make sure that you are taking up as much of their time and real estate as possible.
And hey, key thing there is, you can put anything out there, but try to put things out there that are meaningful to the intended audience, not just to you or the people sitting around the table brainstorming. It's leads me to my next point. The pain point that a lot of recruiting departments face is understanding their data. There's so much data, and different components of that data is important to different people in the within your organization. So when you're looking at that data and you're extracting it out of your reports and that, you need to have your system set up in a way where people can understand it. It starts in your ATS. You have your statuses, you have your tags. Tenstreet does a very good job of giving you all the tools to set it up, but you have to set it up, and you have to, in order to set it up correctly, you have to understand what are you looking for out of it. And that's where you leverage your relationship with your ATS and their customer service. That's where you leverage your relationship with the other departments to find out what data is important. And you set it up right the first time, and it's going to benefit you in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will say, from a recruiter standpoint, having to maintain the statuses, having to leave notes about everything other than, stuff that's used to like try and convince the driver to come over, like what they want, what they're looking for. That's a pain in the butt. And honestly, when you're trying to blaze through stuff, it's easy to kind of overlook it and be able to say, oh, sorry, I didn't put it in there, I missed it, I was busy. But then from a recruiting manager standpoint, it was like I would use those things to collect the data and then make decisions on how to move forward with marketing, how to move forward, with setting policies and different things like that. So ultimately, as a recruiter, it is also really important to make sure you implement all that and put the information in, so that way the people who are giving you the tools to do your job better can actually figure out what tools to give you.
Well, exactly. And you look at some of the cool things that we've rolled out, some of them have revolved around just understanding your data. Understanding it is the first thing that you can do to position yourself in a better way to make educated decisions and efforts that are going to maximize your return on your investment for those marketing dollars spent. But it all starts with the data. So we've actually now have teams built around helping our clients understand that data. And I think that's a huge stride in the right direction that a lot of people just haven't gotten to yet.
I think it's probably, out of all these pinpoints, in my opinion, that's the most important one. Because if you don't have the data, you're just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall.
My gut tells me.
Yeah, like I got a feeling, or like the thing that everybody says is like, oh, that's the way it's always been, that's the way it's going to be done. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. All of those can be completely eliminated with data. And even if you see something and someone's pushing back, if you have the data, they'll cave. Like Charles is amazing at that. If I can show him like, hey, here's the stats, this is where things are falling off, we need to make a change, he's the first to listen. And I am super opinionated, but if you can come to me and show me on paper, I'll be like, oh damn, I was wrong. And that's the other important part of the data, is realizing that data is your answer, not how you feel about things.
Our last pain point is not enough full apps. And this one strikes close to home because I kind of alluded to this one earlier when we were talking about low lead volume. Today's leads are no different than full apps, but you still have recruiting departments that they have prioritized a full app. They believe that it shows a higher intent. And to a certain level, yes. In regards from a driver's perspective, doing that full app is so easy that it doesn't mean a higher intent. But from a recruiting perspective, as someone that leverages those full apps, I could tell you it's very important for pre-screening. I could put out an ad tomorrow, say local driver in Chicago, and get thousands of leads. By having apps, I can prioritize which ones fit my hiring criteria and what I'm looking for. So from a recruiter's perspective, I understand why they prefer that, but also how do you get them? There's various methods that you can use to get those full apps, from touch points to further communications via voice, text, email, to drip campaigns. There's tons of ways to achieve this, but you still have to achieve it. In a lot of recruiting departments, that's what the recruiters are looking for. And if the recruiters are only looking for full apps and they're not getting them, you're not going to get very far with your efforts.
Well, so I have social anxiety, so to get a little bit personal. But this is how I found success with it, was through that. I realized in networking situations or parties or get-togethers or whatever, you'll meet somebody that you don't know, and it'll turn into like, hey, I had a really good time talking to you. Let's meet up and to have a meeting, or, let's go hang out another time, whatever. It's one of those things, what you offered, and sure, people are nice and they're like, oh yeah, I'll totally call you, and it doesn't always happen. But the important thing is that in that time, like if you like that person or want to hang out with them or get their business, you have to provide enough in that amount of time in order for them to have the desire to communicate with you again. So you're going to get more full apps if you can create an experience that's different, that is desirable and seems mutual and valuable, like it provides value to that driver. They're way more likely to fill out the full app and continue to communicate with you.
So one of the cool things is on cents per mile, we always present these topics. You could look back at a lot of our episodes. We've touched upon each one of these individually, but we're also about providing options and solutions. Honestly, you can solve a lot of these. I look at each one of these and cumulatively innovation. You want to work with people that have innovative approaches. Just because it's always been this way doesn't mean it always has to be this way, and doesn't mean you don't have to try to get in there and recreate the wheel. That's one of the best parts of my job. We don't talk about what I do a lot. We try to stay away from it because it's all about bringing people together around these topics. But one of the best parts of my job is working with CDLLife and Hot Seat and collaborating on innovative techniques that are going to help move those needles. And we've actually, when we've gone through this list, I was just sitting there like, oh, we do this. We do all of these. And that's where you need to take strategic approaches to work with people that are caring about this innovation and how they can bring actual tangible results. Whether you do it internally or you bring it externally, I think it's important to look at.
But all right, yeah. And so, I mean, for me, the other thing I think is self-awareness. And like you said, we don't really talk about what we do for our day jobs very much, because we don't want the thing to feel like a sales pitch. This is here to provide you value and make you better at what you do. And so I think self-awareness is huge. And that's one cool thing about, where I work over here on the CDLLife side, is that we do use all the data that we've pulled from drivers. We get the driver perspective, which is what this podcast is all about. So that way we can make better decisions on how we run the world's largest driver community, what products we develop, and that kind of stuff based on the way that drivers operate. And you as a company also need to be self-aware of what you're offering, how it affects drivers, and the driver experience, which I think is huge. But we are a little short on time, so here is an ad break. We're excited to announce CDLConnect sessions powered by CDLLife. 8 exciting webinars packed with insights and innovative strategies to revolutionize the way you connect with drivers. Join us on Thursday, September 19th for our next session, Optimizing Data and Processes for Recruitment Success, with Nick Shopler, Chief Operating Officer of CDLLife. Discover how to optimize your recruitment data and processes for greater success. Click the link in the description to register and browse future sessions.
All right, we're back, and we're talking about, how those pain points affect your organization, recognizing them and offering a couple different perspectives. We're going to be doing a couple that focus on this because this is a critical time for recruiting departments as we enter fourth quarter, and we know the dreaded slowdown, and freight's really not booming too much right now. But stay tuned for next week's episode where we talk about, hey, how's your recruiting department's maturity scale and what is that? But until then, thank you for tuning in to Cents Per Mile. I'm your host, Charles Gracie.
And I'm your co-host, Paul Gibson. See you next time.